What's going on, Packer fans? Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Thank you so much for joining me today. Going to be going over Jace Sternberger in a little bit. Before we get there, I do want to go over the other transactions that Green Bay made first, and then we can kind of transition a little bit into Sternberger. So Green Bay did make a variety of transactions on Tuesday, the first of which was Sternberger. But before we get there, they signed both Sean Davis and RJ McIntosh to the practice squad, releasing Abdullah Anderson as well as Jacob Capra in the process. Remember, they signed Abdullah Anderson right before that last preseason game. Released him and then brought him back to the practice squad. And then Jacob Capra was an undrafted free agent for Green Bay this season. Both now are obviously no longer on the team and will likely try to find practice squads elsewhere. For the two players that Green Bay signed, Sean Davis is a safety. He was a fifth-round pick just this season. So it's a little bit rare to see a current fifth-round pick get released and bounced around a little bit, but that's what happened here, and now he finds himself on Green Bay's practice squad. In all likelihood, a player that the scouting staff and Brian Gutekunst liked in the draft. Maybe didn't have a fifth-round pick on him. Maybe they had a sixth, seventh, or maybe even a priority free agent grade on him. But in all likelihood, they had a draftable grade on him in some capacity, and now they're going to take a closer look at him and see if he might be able to bring something to this team even on the practice squad. The one that's a little bit more intriguing to me is RJ McIntosh. Now, McIntosh was somebody I liked coming out. I probably had, I'll have to look back at it, but I probably had like a third or fourth round grade on McIntosh coming out of the draft. It was 2018 he was drafted, and he was actually a fifth round draft pick. I thought he had a little bit of upside as an interior pass rusher, kind of had some unique size and length that I thought if he used to the best of his ability, he might have some ability to get to the quarterback, probably never becoming a top tier player, but maybe being a sub package type player, being able to be used in a variety of different ways. I think the unique thing about McIntosh is I think everyone right now is wanting Green Bay to add some size and some physicality to that defensive line. And obviously you're just bringing somebody into the practice squad. It's not like you're expecting anyone that you're signing to the practice squad at this point to come in and fix your defensive line issues. But McIntosh isn't always somebody that holds up, super strong at the point of attack. So even if he does make his way to the active roster, I don't think he's a player that all of a sudden you're going to plug him in on the defensive line and be like, okay, now they're going to be able to hold up at the point of attack better. But he's an interesting player nonetheless, and definitely somebody, like I said, I liked coming out of the draft. I thought he was more of an upside plus developmental type guy, and it hasn't turned out so far for him, but he's still young, and we sometimes see people in year 3 or 4 break out, and hopefully that's the case for RJ McIntosh. I won't hold your breath. It's likely just a flyer practice squad signing, but of all the moves, for Green Bay, that was the one that kind of stood out to me from a practice squad standpoint. Of course, the bigger news and the main topic today is that Green Bay did release Jace Sternberger. And to me, and I think a lot of people who cover the team, this was not a surprise in any capacity. At the end of the day, and we can call Josiah DeGuara or Dominique Dafney tight ends, H-backs, whatever you want to call them, but Jace Sternberger would have been the 5th best player in that tight end room, right? You've got Bobby Tunyon, you've got Mercedes Lewis, and then the aforementioned Josiah DeGuara, as well as Dominique Dafney. And Jace Sternberger would have found himself 5th after those first 4 players. And it's just very, very difficult to keep 5 players at that position in that room on the roster at the same time. I think Jace was snake bit a little bit in his early seasons with some injury issues, but I think the issue is you just didn't see progression from him. You take a look at a Robert Tunyon and you saw consistent progression from the day he got to Green Bay up until now. You still see him growing as a player. I feel like even Josiah DeGuara, in the very limited amount of time that we've seen him, he continues to show that he's getting better. And I know that hasn't manifested itself on the field quite yet, but I really do believe that that's the case. I do believe he's growing as a player. You just want to see consistent growth out of a player like that. And unfortunately for Sternberger, that wasn't the case. And even as a blocker, it almost looked like he was at best staying in mud and at worst regressing. There was that play in preseason where just a brutal block on Sternberger's part. And that's just an area of his game where he couldn't get together. He didn't really ever develop a rapport with Aaron Rodgers. His route running needed to be a bit more precise, and it just didn't get to that point. And all of those things combined, added in on a recent suspension, which I thought Sternberger actually handled very, very well. But all of those things combined led to Sternberger's release. And it was reported by Tom Silverstein that Green Bay has a very large interest in bringing him back to the practice squad, which certainly makes sense. You invested a 3rd round pick in him, and there's still upside there. I don't think there's any question about that. As a pure receiving tight end, if he puts it together, he has the ability to be a player in this league. If I were Jace Sternberger and his agent, I would be looking elsewhere, and I'd be surprised if Sternberger comes back to the practice squad. One, it's within the realm of possibility that some team could claim him. Listen, if some team had a 3rd, early 4th round grade on him a couple seasons ago, picking him up off of waivers, there's some bad tight end rooms in this league and some bad tight ends. Getting a developmental guy like Sternberger, it wouldn't shock me if somebody claimed him. Even if he wasn't claimed, I would still kind of expect him to be added to an active roster and not a practice squad. And even if he doesn't end up on an active roster, I think Sternberger and his agents are likely seeing, okay, you've got Tunyon, and I'm sure Green Bay's going to probably want to work out a deal with him. You got Mercedes Lewis, and then you got 2 younger guys and Josiah DeGuara and Dominique Daphne. And there just might not be that spot in Green Bay for Sternberger. And there's definitely better spots where he could go, where there's a path to playing time sooner rather than later. And that's probably what Jace needs right now, is some reps and some confidence and just somewhere where he can go and have his skills utilized to the best of his ability. So we'll see what happens, but this was not surprising to me in any way, shape, or form. You might ask, well, Andy, why didn't they just release him prior to cut downs, then keeping him on the suspend list? There is some cap savings for Green Bay with him being suspended for the 2 weeks. So it actually, from a financial standpoint and an accounting standpoint, keeping him on the roster and suspended for 2 weeks, there's actually financial savings there rather than releasing him at cut downs at that point. So that's the reason they did it that way. Also, it's basically a free roster spot, right? So you're not paying him during that time frame. If all of a sudden you get to this point and Josiah DeGuara, his injury was much worse and he had to be placed on IR, or maybe you lose a different tight end on the roster, and the position gets weak. Well, now you've got Sternberger coming back from suspension and you can just add him to the active roster if need be, rather than releasing him ahead of time. And, it just makes a lot more logistical sense, both financially and just overall, to give yourself an out if all of a sudden your tight end room gets obliterated by injuries. Now you've got Sternberger who can come back and you can put him right back on the roster. So we'll see. I would love to see him back on the practice squad. I don't expect that to be the case, but we'll see what happens there. And if any team ends up claiming him, and it'll be interesting to keep an eye on his career moving forward, regardless of where he ends up. Now, one of the things I tweeted is Jace Sternberger was obviously a 3rd round draft pick, and I tweeted out Green Bay's most recent 3rd round draft pick. So that was going back to 2011, I want to say. Alex Green, the running back out of Hawaii, I believe it was, Kyrie Thornton, the defensive tackle, Richard Rodgers, the tight end, Ty Montgomery, Kyler Fackrell, Montravius Adams, Oren Burks, Jace Sternberger, Josiah DeGuara, and Amari Rodgers. So once again, Alex Green, Kyrie Thornton, Richard Rodgers, Ty Montgomery, Kyler Fackrell, Montravius Adams, Oren Burks, Jace Sternberger, Josiah DeGuara, and Amari Rodgers. Those were their last 10 draft picks. Now, jury completely out on DeGuara and Amari at this point, right? I don't think we can jump to any conclusions with those two players. It's just going to take time to evaluate where they're at. Even Oren Burks, while I think it's not trending in the right direction, there's still, he's still on the roster, right? So that counts for something, and we'll see if he could have some sort of breakout at some point. I'm not betting on it, but there's still some meat on the bone, whether it's minuscule or not. My point wasn't necessarily anything. I think it goes without saying that this isn't a great string of 3rd round picks. And again, maybe Amari Rodgers completely flips that on his head and all of a sudden he becomes a really great wide receiver. But I think it's been a struggle. And there's no point to this, right? I think Green Bay's mostly been a really solid drafting team. I don't think you can just look at one round and be like, well, that means they're a terrible drafting team. But these are top 100 draft picks. And that's where you really want to make your money in the draft, is with those top 100 picks. And that's where, you can really still find some really talented players. And I think for the most part, you'd have to argue that Green Bay has struck out a little bit. And no disrespect to anyone on this list, but if Kyler Fackrell is at this point the best of the 10 players of 10 third round picks in the last 10-ish years, it's probably not going great, right? And I've heard other people say, listen, Richard Rodgers actually just signed to a practice squad, to the Eagles practice squad. He's had overall a really solid career in the NFL. Ty Montgomery's still in the league. Kyler Fackrell's still in the league and had a nice term with Green Bay. Montravius Adams is still in the league. He's on the Saints right now. Oren Burks is still a Packer. Jace Sternberger, in all likelihood, is going to be on a roster sooner rather than later. Josiah DeGuara is still a Packer. Amari Rodgers is still a Packer. And Kyrie Thornton and Alex Green were the ones, almost a decade ago. So you might say, Andy, listen, these are all hits to some extent. Like, these are players who played in the NFL. And yes, you're not wrong. However, my argument is that you draft to find the top end talent. You're drafting to try to find players who could be, at minimum starters, if not top tier starters in this league. That's who you're trying to unearth, especially in those top 100 picks in the draft. Let's just be real here, right? You can find guys on the street or in free agency that aren't going to cost a lot of money. That you can find Richard Rodgers, you can find a Ty Montgomery, you can find a Kyler Fackrell, you can find Montravius Adams and Oren Burks, a Jace Sternberger, a Josiah DeGuara, even up to this point. You can find those guys to fill spots on your roster right now. When you're picking in the top 100 and when you're picking in the draft in general, you're very much trying to find top-end talent, starting caliber players who are going to push you to the next level. And I think for the most part, you can argue that Green Bay struck out in the third round. Like I said, there's no major point here. I'm not saying trade away all future third round picks. Again, Green Bay's mostly been successful drafting during that time frame. There's definitely been some hiccups along the way, but it is a bit concerning that they've had some struggles in the third round, and it's definitely something that you hope to see better results from moving forward. And the last thing I'll say here before I let you guys go is talent evaluation is such a very odd and weird thing, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what round you find a player. And if you find a good player, you find a good player. And what I mean by that is, again, this is not a commentary on Josiah DeGuara at all, because the jury is still out and we'll see what happens with him when he comes back from injury. But everything that this front office really wanted Jace Sternberger and Josiah DeGuara to be, basically Robert Tonyan and Dominique Dafney sort of are right now. Daphne's filled in that H-back role very nicely. Tonyan's been the all-around tight end, their receiving threat. We saw another great touchdown from him last week. If Robert Tonyan and Dominique Dafney, when Green Bay signed both of those players, turned into absolutely nothing, you wouldn't have been surprised by it. And if Jace Sternberger turned into what Robert Tonyan is today, and if Josiah DeGuara turned into what Dominique Dafney is today, you'd be like, okay, they got some value out of those third round. And certainly with Tonyan, you got a lot of value there, right? So it's just a weird thing. Like, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where they were drafted or how you found them. If you found those spots and filled those spots, whether it be undrafted free agency, a third round pick, a first round pick, that's all that matters. And that's what's so crazy about the NFL and how hard it is to evaluate talent. You can find everything you were hoping to find with those two players in the third round, with two complete nobodies off the street in Dominique Dafney and Robert Tonyan, obviously. So Green Bay did a good job still filling out that tight end room. They didn't get their bang on their buck, certainly with Jace Sternberger, and time will still tell with Josiah DeGuara, but you still have to give Green Bay's front office credit for finding the guys that they needed nonetheless, even if those two were undrafted free agent type players. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I always appreciate it. I will be right back here tomorrow with an all-new episode. Make sure not to miss it and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.